My husband has one coat, this ski jacket. And even though he matches this Dragonite really well, every man needs a proper wool coat. When we were dating, I told him if he married me, I would make him one. And now I must fulfill my promise. We started off by going to Nordstrom to try on some coats to get a sense of which colors and styles look the best on him. We really liked the grays and blacks. And silhouette-wise, this Mackage coat seemed both current and classic. Single-breasted top coats like these are really in style for men right now. This particular coat retails for $12.90 USD, and if I wasn't already sold, seeing this model with not one, but 2 Doberman pinchers sealed my decision. Soon, my husband will also be that stylish. Now to find a pattern. I checked my usual go-to spot for coat patterns, Simplicity. This Vogue pattern was promising, but my husband didn't like the collar style. I also heavily considered the Goldstream Peacoat, but ultimately decided it was a little casual for what I had in mind. Eventually, I stumbled on a company called Grasser, and I fell in love with their 639 pattern. It is a dead ringer for the Mackage coat. I searched Instagram for completed versions of 639, and they all looked fabulous, which is a good sign. Purchasing the pattern through PayPal, since it is a Russian site, was simple, and I had my pattern. You select your size, including height at the time of purchasing. Off to fabric shopping we went, starting with a New York fave, B&J Fabrics. Their wools were so luscious, but also very expensive. These ones were $105 and $130 a yard, respectively. Our favorite from B&J's was this particularly soft mink coating that was $130 a yard. Next, we went to Mood, which has much lower priced coat wools, usually between $40 and $90 a yard. Zeroing in on grays, we found some good options, but settled on this one that was dead stock from the Row. The Row had a controversial sample sale last year, but the fabric was soft, thick, and had wonderful dimension. So we picked up 2.75 yards of it at $50 a yard. We went back to B&J's for the lining, picking up a gorgeous 40 Mame silk. It was a crepeback satin, and we got 1.5 yards at $105 a yard. Yikes. I didn't like how the buttons at Mood were plastic, so we found some better ones at Lulu Buttons. Now let's recap what we got with a haul. Here is the silk. 40 Mame should hold up in a coat better than a thinner charmeuse, for example. Next are the buttons, and my husband loved these lion head buttons. They will add such a unique touch to his coat. I also got a few in case any fall off. Next are some notions that we got from the notion store right next to Mood. It's called Steinloff and Staller. I got some shoulder pads that are not too thick, some sleeve heads, some jacket fronts. They only came in size 44, but that should cover a good amount of standard sizes. I also got the woven interfacing in black, and it feels quite nice. Then there was the collar felt, which was the most disappointing. It was only partially wool, according to a burn test that I did. And he only sold it, I believe, in half-yard increments. My receipt does not have the itemized list of everything, which also makes me think that he gives different prices to different people. Finally, there is the wool. It appears to be somewhat double-faced since the wrong side is a solid black. I love the mottled and heathered appearance of the gray side. I think it adds some historical feel to the fabric that I love. I did assemble this pattern at home since I didn't know how to use their plotter file that they include. It didn't appear to be the standard AO copy shop file that I'm used to. Normally for a coat, I would do anything to avoid assembling the pattern myself, since there are so many pieces, but this was an exception. The writing on this pattern looks intimidating at first, but really it's just all the usual info that we see on patterns. I think it's just the Russian characters make it look scary. I picked the size based on the chest measurement, but according to the size chart, I knew I'd have to make some adjustments to the front. I followed the Ellie and Mac blog post about making a full tummy adjustment to account for that discrepancy in measurements. Next was to make a muslin to check the fit. This was muslin fabric I already had, but it used up the last of what I had, so I need to buy more now. Here's the fit of the muslin. The arms were a bit restricted, but wool coats usually are, and I decided it might have been aggravated by my using of a slightly bigger seam allowance for the sleeves in this muslin. So no changes were made to that. We also tried it on with a coat he might wear underneath to add extra warmth. This jacket is heated, so he could be super toasty if he wants. I adjusted the lining front pieces to match the main fabric, and as you can see with these lined up pieces, the lining on the bottom is a bit bigger, but that is what you want. It's not very intuitive, but it does work. Next, I had to roll up our carpet and prep the floor by vacuuming and Swiffering. I laid out the fabric on the floor with a clean towel underneath. Then I hovered my iron over the surface and steamed it to shrink it out before you start sewing. The towel absorbs the excess moisture and also helps you keep track of which sections have been steamed already, since you can move it around underneath. This was 2.75 yards of around 60-inch wide fabric, and getting the pieces all on was a bit of a squeeze. Using a tape measure, I made sure the grain lines were parallel to the selvage. What I'm doing here was adding extra allowance for interfacing and fitting. On all the pieces that were interfaced fully, you're supposed to add 1 to 2 centimeters all around, and then another 1.5 to 3 centimeters for fitting. So on pieces like the front that are fully interfaced, I added 4 centimeters in total all around, and then only 1.5 centimeters all around on the uninterfaced pieces like the sleeves and the back. I had never done this before, but I wanted to follow the pattern instructions really well. It certainly used up a lot more fabric. I genuinely had none left over, which I'm not mad about. Then I cut the interfacing pieces, adding the extra 1.5 centimeters for fitting. Certain pieces, like the sleeves and back, are only partially interfaced. So by tracing and freehand drawing, I made up the shapes indicated. I ran low on interfacing and had to piece together some of the pieces for the bottoms of the sleeves and such. Before applying interfacing, it is important to test on a scrap first. I also used a silk organza press cloth to protect my iron from the glue. Everything looked good, so I began the process of interfacing. This always takes longer than expected and is very boring, to be frank. After interfacing, I cut off this extra allowance that I left for fusing, and I just used the interfacing as a guide. Before basting together the coat, I needed to mark the darts, so I tested some marking tools. The yellow Clover Choco liner is known to leave a yellowish hue behind, and chalk paper didn't show up enough. So any markings that I had to make on the front of the garment, I did with either white chalk pencil or thread tracing. It is useful to plan out which markings need to be on which side. Dart markings, for example, should be on the wrong side, while welt pocket frame markings should be on the right side. This pattern also includes interfacing templates around the welt pockets, which should be on the wrong side. The lapel roll line should be on both sides, as well as the hemline and the center front line. Since I am using pre-made jacket fronts, I will line them up with the roll line and mark the chest pocket on the right side once I've attached them. Here I am thread tracing the center front line. In this clip, I thread traced part of the welt pocket markings, but this is actually the interfacing template, so I could have just drawn it on the wrong side. Oh well. After you thread trace, you must snip the stitches and lift the pattern off. This should only be done on a single layer, and it will mark both sides. Now to baste together the coat for a fitting. I did this by hand using the regular 1 centimeter seam allowance. If I were doing this again, I would have sewn the size that I made for the muslin, just with extra seam allowance. You could see how overly big the fitting allowance made the coat, and it was unnecessary to test out this bigger garment when I knew that the muslin was a close fit. When I resewed it using the intended seam lines from the size I picked, it fit great. There was some extra room in the hips, but when I tried to pin it out, I didn't like how the shape of the back panel became tapered on the bottom. I also didn't want to unbalance the garment, so I left it as it was. We also tried it on with his heated jacket underneath and then with the sleeves as well. Feeling good about the fit, I then had to unpick all the basting. This goes fast and feels fun to be destructive. I cut away the fitting allowance and added the notches. I also finished adding any markings that I had waited on, like this chest pocket and dart that had been covered in the coat front interfacing. Using simple black Gutermann thread, I started to sew, but I forgot to stop sewing before the edge, like in the instructions, so I had to unpick until that yellow line. Then I made a clip into the corner and pressed the seam open and the vent closed. I also pressed up the hem, which is very useful to do. It felt so good to be sewing, but then I made a frustrating realization. I forgot to add the little strips of interfacing on all the pieces. In the pattern, there is a helpful diagram that indicates where to put it and how thick and if it's bias cut or straight of grain. Anyway, it was a huge pain since I wanted to be sewing and, making progress on my coat. And here's just a clip. I accidentally interfaced the whole way down instead of stopping at the hem. The dart and pocket markings got covered up by the interfacing, so I remarked them. I basted the dart close and I went to sew it. Since there were so many layers, including cotton batting, it was difficult to sew off the edge and make sure the wool was caught in the stitching. It took me a couple of times. I cut open the bottom of the dart and I pressed that part open. Then I basted the pocket opening closed for now. There was a small bump when I did this, but I was able to minimize it by shrinking it with steam. Next, I attached the front to the side front, taking care to ensure the pocket frame lines line up, even after basting. After sewing, I pressed the seam, and of course, I have to mention a wood clapper is essential for coat making. At this point, I also realized I had forgotten to mark the hem lines, so I did that with thread on all the pieces. This makes attaching the lining so much easier later on. Don't skip this. Time to work on the pockets. I opted for a cotton pocket bag rather than satin, especially in coats, since they are more durable. My husband liked this lavender fabric, so I went with this one. The first step is to sew the pocket flaps together. The interfaced flap lining is attached to the uninterfaced main flap. You press it well and flip right side out. This is just a nice, simple, and satisfying step before the welt pocket madness, which is slightly stressful. It is time to press the welts closed. They needed a lot of pressing in order to hold the folds because this material is quite thick. You can see I marked them on the wrong side, but all the markings only need to be on the right side, so I had to redo that. Next, I attached the facing to the short edge of the pocket bag. I understitched it with a matching lavender thread, which is just a detail I like to add in. The upper pocket welt says face on the pattern. It is a bit confusing in the instructions, as we'll see later on, but this just means to cut the piece with the right side of the fabric facing up. Then stitch the edges together, right sides together. Here I noticed my upper pocket bag was looking smaller than the picture. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter, but at the time I was kind of confused and it made me feel like I was doing something wrong. Now I'll be stitching down the welts for both the upper and the lower pockets. The key to sewing welt pockets is all in your markings. Mark well, then hand baste carefully, ideally in a matching color, just in case it is hard to take out. I wish I had done that. Once you've sewn one line, make sure your next line is parallel to that one. They should also start and stop in the right places as marked on the pattern. If it's off, fix it before you cut anything. Then, after cutting, the sewing is quite simple. Just sew over the little triangles on each side and close up the pocket bag. If you get confused with the pocket bag, pretend to use the pocket. There should be no raw edges that your hand encounters when it goes inside. On the upper welt, the free edges are then hand sewn so it stays upright. Here is some footage of me completing the same process for the lower pockets. The fabric was a little bulky for the narrowness of these welts, but I managed all right. I removed the basting after I had stitched the triangles and inserted the flaps. If your flaps are too short, long, or uneven, it will make your coat look handmade. So I got out a ruler and really took my time. This seam was too many layers and it broke multiple needles of mine. So I decided to sew it by hand using Emma Sandy's tutorial. And after that headache, finishing the pocket was simple. Now onto a tedious but worth it step, pad stitching. I thought this undercolor piece was shaped weird, but when I checked it, it was correct. I traced the piece and removed the seam allowance and added a bit of extra center back seam allowance. Then I cut it out of hair canvas on the bias. I removed the added seam allowance on the center back on one side and did a lapped seam with a zigzag. That's just my go-to way of joining hair canvas. Cut out the actual undercollar piece out of collar felts and hand baste them together. This is what I'm going for, except I also used tailor's tape on the roll line. For the lapels, I did the same process of tracing and removing the seam allowance. I realized it should be on the straight of grain, not the bias, like the undercollar is, and so I fixed that and cut it out. While taping the roll line, I applied some tension, and I made sure that both lapels were evenly taut before catch stitching that down. Using silk thread, I started the boring process of pad stitching. My favorite video on pad stitching is the one by Lori Kuritz with a K, if you'd like an in-depth tutorial. It was cozy though to do this while it was snowing outside, so that was the silver lining. With that done, I attached the front to the facing. There was a seam allowance discrepancy between the pattern piece and the instructions, so I decided to follow the 0.7 centimeters as directed in the instructions. I pressed the top half of the seam allowance one way and then the bottom another way, and then understitched on the corresponding side. It sounds confusing, but this is just to account for the facing flipping outwards to become the lapel. I quickly constructed the rest of the coat shell, including the shoulder seams. This is such a motivating part of the process because things are easy, fast, and satisfying. This refueled my energy in time for the collar. I joined the collar stand to the collar and snipped into the seam allowance. This seam is then pressed open. I found it helpful to mark the seam allowance on the collar for the next step. I was very confused by the concept of having raw edges on the right side. So I checked a ready-to-wear coat in Macy's, and sure enough, that's how they do it. I suppose it's because collar felt is too bulky to do a full seam with. After joining the undercollar to the collar and pressing so that the felt stays hidden underneath, I stitched the short edges of the collars, making sure to leave the 1 centimeter gap as indicated, and to push the seam allowance towards the undercollar side, stitch over it. I clipped the corners and then turned them right side out. These joint marks are very important for attaching the collar well. Have them visible on both sides just in case. I included this clip of me labeling the instructions there because it helped me so much knowing how to complete this step. Next is another zigzagged kind of lapped seam of the raw edge felt, which in hindsight, I would have basted this because I kept stabbing myself with the pins and it tended to shift a lot. Then this short top edge of the facing in front is sewn. It is important it stops right at that first joint point we marked. Then it is time for the last remaining seam. Again, starting and stopping at those plus sign joint markings that are so important. Then we use a point turner to push out the corners, and that's it. I was very relieved to be done this part. I should have said you're done with machine sewing because there's a little bit of hand sewing to do to make sure that this collar edge lies flat and doesn't puff out. So that's really a crucial step. After that, you can sit back and admire your work. The rest of the main fabric construction is simple. You straighten this marked line on the sleeve on the ironing board and you steam it. This is to add some shaping to the sleeve that follows the natural bend of the arm. The excess fabric created by straightening that line can be shrunken with steam. This step in the instructions confused me at first, but I learned basically you want to do the shrinking and pulling with both of the sleeve pieces on top of each other, and then flip it over so that each side gets equal amount of steam and you can make sure they're even throughout. The wording of this pressing step confused me, but when in doubt, just make it look like the photo. While pressing the vent, I also pressed up the hem. This in turn makes mitering the corner easier as well. I don't know about you, but I love a good mitered corner. Make sure to press the mitered seam open. For the sleeve vents, I knew I wanted a keyhole buttonhole shape, so I tested it out a few times first. Before sewing, I drew in the lines of the buttonholes, making sure that the diagonal line is pointing down from the edge. Mine came out uneven, unfortunately, a little uneven in length and a bit unparallel. So if I were doing it again, I would have made the marking lines longer so they were easier to see. I would have also used the manual buttonhole feature instead of automatic, because automatic tends to be not very reliable on thick fabrics, at least for my machine. I knew once the buttons were in, the holes wouldn't look as bad. So this was something I didn't obsess over. I just, made my peace with it. After sewing the first seam of the sleeve, I sewed the E-stitching into the sleeve cap. Then I pulled the bobbin thread, make sure it's the bobbin thread, not the top thread, and I used the stitches and steam to shrink the cap. I sewed the rest of the sleeve tube and then pressed it using a handy seam roll. You can tell I made this one myself because it's very uneven and lumpy. Now, it's very important to make note of which sleeve is which. With the shaping, it should be quite obvious, but identify that before sewing them in and make sure to double check it. After sewing the sleeves in, I added the sleeve head and a round of reinforcement stitching. Sleeve heads give that nice structure to the E's in the sleeve cap. To apply the shoulder pads, I tacked them in by hand using this Sarah Veblen tutorial. It was very quick and simple. Now it is time to cut into the precious lining fabric. Because of the cost, I even considered saving this for a future coat, since it seemed wrong that the lining is more expensive than the wool. I only got 1.5 yards and it wasn't enough. As you can see, I had to cut the side front pieces on the cross grain and then the sleeves out of leftover kasha lining that I had. I did not think to buy silk pins and quickly realized why they're important. Even my sharpest pins could not enter the fabric without risk of damage. As an alternative, I weighed down the pattern piece and traced around it with a chalk liner, using that as a guide to cut. The cutting layout for the lining made it difficult to tell how the left and right back pieces were to be cut out. On the layout, it shows them as normal on the fabric, not flipped over, and the yellow box says that the fabric should be right side down or wrong side up in that layout, but the green box says the opposite for pieces marked with the word face. I checked with future steps in the instructions and looking at the photos, and I found that the green box was correct. When cutting the silk, I cut the notches outside of the piece to increase the durability and to reduce fraying. When I was cutting out the sleeves, I really noticed how much more beautiful the silk was. You cannot beat that thread count. To reduce fraying, I zigzagged all around the edges of the pieces. I reduced the tension and the presser foot pressure, and I used a size 60 Microtex needle. Unfortunately, we are not done with the welt pockets because there is another internal one in the lining. I marked it fairly easily with chalk paper and then straight tailor's chalk for the welt itself. Basting it by hand first allowed me to get a very accurate stitching line. I used the cotton for the pocket bag, but I wish I had used a matching silk or even the blue kasha. Since this pocket doesn't have a flap or closure, the pocket bag shows a little bit, and the purple stands out in a bad way. Also, make sure when you sew the pocket bag that the fold line is in the right spot. I had to unpick mine and resew it because it didn't hang well. Stitching the lining pieces together is luckily quite straightforward. Just make sure to add the pleat in the center back. The instructions also indicate to leave holes in the left side seam and sleeve seam. I was confused by which the left side of the lining is. Is it the left side when you look at the coat, or is it the side that lines the wearer's left? Avoid the confusion and just refer to the names on the back pieces. That will point you to which side of the lining is left. Once the mismatched sleeves are constructed, they're mismatched because of the fabric in my case, it is time to sew them in. Luckily, they won't be noticeable even when the coat is taken off, so the fact I'm not using silk on the sleeves doesn't bother me too much, and I was able to use up some scraps. The pattern uses small rectangles of fabric to anchor the lining to the shell. I'm used to using thread tacks, so this was new to me. I enjoyed how much quicker they felt than thread tacks and how much sturdier they felt as well. Due to the marking of my pocket bag and it not having a distinct right or wrong side, I couldn't tell if my placing mark for the fabric tag was right or wrong. Spoiler, it was wrong. So put it on the side that will be closer to the front facing when you sew everything together, since it will be enclosed in that seam. Making a hanging loop was also a nice touch, although it's always better to hang it on a hanger or lay flat. I used the bobby pin method to flip out this small tube. There are lots of tutorials on this if you search them up. It's my favorite method. Time for the longest seam in the entire project, stitching the lining to the front facing and collar. I would highly recommend hand basting this first because it is so much fabric to wrangle beside the machine. You will almost 100% stab yourself with pins. Make sure that the internal pocket also is flipped the proper way when you do this, because I had to unpick mine and redo it. Next, from the inside, I stitched the two collar seam allowances together. I do not know if this was the intended stitch because it didn't say, just said to hand sew, but it seemed to work pretty well. To attach the lining at the sleeve hems, line up the seams so the arm is not twisted inside, and pin the lining how it should look. I turned the coat inside out for this, and just know that these pins are temporary. We'll take them out later. Then reach to the inside of the two layers and repin it from the wrong side, taking out the old pins. At first, I could not figure out how to get the lining to fit the sleeve end, but then I realized the sleeve end is supposed to be shut when you attach the lining. This means the vent is not really meant to be opened, and there would be raw edges if you do. But it's fine since most people probably won't be undoing their sleeve buttons. Okay, here I admit I skipped a step. I couldn't figure out how to hand sew this and what to do, so I just didn't do it because I've never done something like that before, and it's usually fine. So we'll see how it lasts. I attached a few more fabric tabs. These were the sleeve ones, and then it was time to work on the hem. Like I've mentioned, pre-pressing the hem helps so much, so don't skip that. Sewing the hem is split up into two parts. Make sure you start with the right side of the coat. You sew a kind of strange slope from the facing edge down into the lining, and then you trim the facing side only of this. This bending the lining step had me a bit confused by the wording, but looking at the two notches in the photo helped me orient myself. In this step, you can see how the facing is folded towards the lining on the left there, instead of that seam allowance of the facing being right on the left side, if that makes sense. Oh, seeing everything all clean makes me so happy. The instructions say to hand baste this edge down. I wish I had used a silk thread for this, since silk usually doesn't leave impressions from pressing, but this brown thread did. Then I sewed the other side with that same triangular slope down from the facing edge. To make sure the hem stays in place, you hand sew all along, attaching the lining seam allowance to the wool. Then you add small French tacks by the vent. It said to top stitch the hem through the technical hole, but I couldn't see the point, and I found it very difficult, so I top stitched it through both layers. I think it worked out fine. We'll see. Then you can sew up those technical holes, one by machine, and then I decided to close the other one by hand, but you probably could do that one by machine too if you don't mind the kind of messy look. You are also supposed to stitch in the ditch for this collar seam, which I did by hand. In my Melody dress video, I vowed to never cut buttonholes with a seam ripper again. So I got this $9 buttonhole cutter kit. I used it on the sleeve buttonholes and it worked great. A lot more precise and less risky. I tried to use this super thick Tex 105 cotton thread from Wawak to attach the buttons, but most of my hand sewing needles were too small for it, so I ended up using regular thread for all but one. Again, these buttons were from Lulu Buttons in Manhattan, and I am a broken record, but I love how unique they are. Now it was time to sew the main buttonholes on the coat. On all my other wool coats, I used bound buttonholes, which you do at the very beginning of the project. So this was new to me. I wanted a beautiful corded keyhole buttonhole. like the ones I saw on these coats at Max Mara. I heavily considered going to Jonathan Embroidery for the buttonholes since they have a machine that can do them very well, and I'm in New York. However, I spooked myself by reading their bad reviews. They have lots of good reviews too, but there were multiple mentions of garments being ruined. Let me know in the comments if you would be interested in a review of the place though, because I am curious. To make my own corded buttonholes, I bought some sashiko thread to use as cording. I plan to use my automatic buttonholer, so I checked the size of my button and did a few tests on interfaced scraps. The issue I ran into was that my cording was too thick, and so it was being caught by the satin stitches. I also had issues adding the cording with the way the automatic buttonholer sews, in the order it does things in. It's hard to know when it will turn around on each side, so you lose a bit of control. I amended this by using the black cotton thread from earlier, as it was thinner. It was Tex 105 versus the Sashiko, which was Tex 400. So I decided to go manual for the added control. This meant my markings needed to be super clear and even. I also needed to know exactly how far away I wanted my buttons to be from the edge. The pattern marks them at 1 inch away from the edge, at least that's what I found. In hindsight, for the size of my button, I probably would have put it a little closer to the edge, maybe by 1/4 of an inch. I marked super clearly with a chalk pencil and measured to make sure all of my templates were equal. I messed up the edge of my first one, but I managed to save it and make it not too noticeable. I think the gray color is really helping me out here. On my second, I realized that I had put the keyhole on the wrong side. Oh well. My machine honestly didn't make very good or defined keyholes anyway. So on my third one and in the future, I would just opt for a straight standard buttonhole. By the way, if you're wondering how to do a corded buttonhole yourself, I followed Professor Pincushion's guide on sewing them, and when I used the manual foot, I could exactly follow the steps. It was great. Before sewing the buttons, it is very important to line the bottom of your coat up and then insert a pin and mark that as your button placement. I sewed them with the thick Tex 105 thread, so you want to use a strong thread. Don't forget to fray check your buttonholes. I actually forgot and had to do that a few days later. So now it's just finishing up. I had to use tweezers and seam rippers and all these tools to pull out the basting and marking threads. And I did the hand sewing slip stitch around the collar, lapels, and left front of the coat. Of course, I gave it a final press, which I was so impatient during. And then I was done. Before I show the coat, I'll do the cost breakdown. I spent what I expected to on the wool fabric, but much more on the lining. In a few years, we'll know if that was worth it. I believe beautiful fabrics deserve to be worn, and a coat gets a lot of wear. And the cool thing about coat linings is that people actually see them when you take the coat on and off, unlike dresses. The notions were a little bit pricey from Steinlauf and Staller. I probably would have gotten them from somewhere else. The pattern was very reasonable though, $11, easy. Buttons were pricey, but like I've been saying, they're very unique and I think it's worth it for metal buttons. When I add up the total, it seems like so much. However, I'm glad I used quality materials, and the materials inspired me to go slow and not cut corners, so I think it's worth it. Here the coat is in motion, walking down the street. Look how nice his broad shoulders look in a coat like this. To be honest, I think this is my most proud project. I was very intimidated to sew something from a Russian pattern company, but their instructions were for the most part clear and very thorough in all the steps they included. I wouldn't use it as a first-time coat pattern, but if you've made one before, it should be pretty straightforward. I also really like how you select your height when you're buying the pattern. As a 5'11" woman, it makes me want to try some of their patterns for myself as well. While my husband pulls off a ski jacket really well, he looks so dapper and handsome in this coat. First project of 2026, a success! For more sewing process and pattern review videos, subscribe. Until next time, happy sewing!